Before we begin, please like, follow, and subscribe for more dark folklore and haunted history. Thank you for supporting the channel. In 1970, hundreds of people stormed a London cemetery looking for a vampire. They carried stakes, crosses, and homemade weapons. Some believed an undead creature was hiding among the tombs. Others thought it was hysteria. But the legend they created still haunts Highgate Cemetery today. This is the story of the Highgate Vampire. Highgate Cemetery sits in North London, and even before the vampire legend began, it already looked like the perfect setting for a Gothic nightmare. Opened in 1839, Highgate was part of a group of grand Victorian cemeteries built to relieve London's overcrowded churchyards. At the time, it was elegant, expensive, and prestigious. Wealthy families built elaborate tombs. Angels watched over graves. Mausoleums rose like miniature temples. Stone lions, broken columns, and carved crosses filled the landscape. But by the mid-20th century, the cemetery had fallen into decay. Paths became choked with weeds. Tombs cracked open. Ivy swallowed monuments. Trees grew wild. And Highgate transformed from a carefully maintained burial ground into something much darker. A place where nature seemed to be reclaiming the dead. For teenagers, occult enthusiasts, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers, it became irresistible. A forgotten Victorian cemetery. Overgrown, isolated, full of rumors. And at night, locals claimed it felt less like a cemetery and more like a place that was watching them. The earliest stories connected to the Highgate Vampire began circulating in the 1960s. Witnesses reported seeing a strange figure near the cemetery gates and surrounding streets. Some described it as extremely tall. Others said it had burning eyes. A few claimed it wore a long black cloak. One report described a figure gliding across the cemetery without making a sound. Another spoke of something vanishing through the iron gates. And then there were stories of people feeling suddenly frozen with fear near the cemetery, as if something unseen had stepped close to them. The legend grew quickly because the descriptions were not just of a ghost. They were of something more physical, more predatory, something that seemed to move with purpose. Around this same time, stories began spreading about dead animals found near the cemetery. Foxes and other small creatures were allegedly discovered with strange wounds. Some claimed they had been drained of blood. Whether these reports were exaggerated, misremembered, or entirely invented, they became fuel for the legend. Because once people started using one word, the story changed forever. That word was vampire. One of the most important figures in the Highgate Vampire story was David Farrant. Farrant was a British occultist who became publicly associated with the case after he claimed to have seen a mysterious figure near Highgate Cemetery. In late 1969, he wrote to a local newspaper describing what he had witnessed. He did not initially call it a vampire. Instead, he described a supernatural presence, a grey figure, something eerie and unexplained. But once the press picked up the story, the Highgate legend gained momentum. More people came forward. Some claimed they had seen spectral shapes. Others described strange encounters near the graves. The cemetery became a magnet for curiosity, and the more people talked about Highgate, the more the legend evolved. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the case. At first, the entity was vague, a shadow, a ghost, a presence. But within months, public imagination sharpened it into something far more dramatic. A vampire. Not just any vampire, a king vampire, a sinister undead figure supposedly haunting one of London's most atmospheric cemeteries. The second major figure in the story was Sean Manchester. Manchester claimed the Highgate entity was not merely a ghost, but a true vampire. According to his version of the law, The being was connected to an ancient evil presence. Some versions of the story suggested it had links to a nobleman from Eastern Europe. Others painted it as a powerful undead creature that had taken residence in the cemetery. Manchester became one of the most vocal vampire hunters involved in the case. He believed the entity had to be confronted directly, and as his claims gained attention, the story became more intense. Now the Highgate mystery had two rival personalities at the center of it, David Farrant and Sean Manchester. Both became associated with the legend. Both gave interviews, both drew media attention, and both helped turn Highgate from a local ghost story into a national obsession. But their interpretations were very different. Farrant leaned toward occult and psychic explanations. Manchester leaned fully into vampire lore. And the public loved it, because this was not just a ghost story anymore. This was a supernatural feud playing out in newspapers, interviews, and eventually, inside the cemetery itself. By 1970, the Highgate Vampire had become a media event. Newspapers ran stories about strange sightings. Television crews became interested. Curious visitors started arriving at the cemetery, hoping to glimpse the creature for themselves. And then the legend reached a boiling point. On Friday the 13th, in March 1970, a televised interview helped ignite public excitement. The idea that a vampire might be lurking in a London cemetery was irresistible. That night, crowds reportedly descended on Highgate Cemetery. Some came as thrill-seekers. Some came as believers. Some came with stakes, crosses, and homemade vampire hunting tools. The scene became chaotic. People climbed walls. They forced their way into the cemetery. They searched tombs and shadows. They were not just watching the legend anymore. They were participating in it. This is where the Highgate Vampire story becomes more than folklore. It becomes mass hysteria. A modern urban legend brought to life by television, newspapers, gothic atmosphere, and public imagination. For one night, Londoners behaved as if vampires were real, and Highgate Cemetery became the stage. As the story developed, several tombs and vaults within Highgate became linked to vampire hunting claims. There were stories of coffins being opened, graves being disturbed, bodies being examined. Some accounts claimed that a vampire had been found and destroyed. Others suggested the entity had escaped. One of the most dramatic versions of the legend claims that the vampire was tracked to a tomb where it was confronted in classic Gothic fashion. Stake, holy symbols, ritual, final destruction. But separating fact from folklore in the Highgate case is almost impossible. That's because the story was told and retold through competing accounts. Each version became more theatrical. Each retelling added new details. The vampire became taller. The sightings became darker. The cemetery became more cursed. And the legend became harder to untangle from the people who promoted it. What we know for certain is this: Highgate Cemetery suffered real damage during the panic. Tombs were vandalized, graves were disturbed, human remains were reportedly interfered with. The vampire legend had crossed from spooky rumor into real-world consequences. And that gave the story a darker edge. Because whether or not a vampire ever existed, the fear absolutely did. The Highgate Vampire story worked because the setting was perfect. Highgate Cemetery already looked like something from a Gothic novel. It had winding paths, crumbling stone, Victorian statues, family vaults, overgrown vegetation, and an atmosphere of decay. It was easy to imagine something ancient hiding there, but the timing also mattered. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of renewed interest in the occult. Horror films were popular. Vampire stories were everywhere. Hammer horror had brought Dracula back into British pop culture with blood, drama, and gothic style. People were already primed to believe in dark forces, secret rituals, and supernatural threats. Then came Highgate, a real cemetery, real witnesses, real newspaper coverage, real vampire hunters. It had every ingredient needed for a modern myth. And once the public imagination took hold, the legend became almost impossible to stop. One of the reasons the Highgate Vampire remains famous is the long-running dispute between David Farrant and Sean Manchester. Their rivalry became almost as legendary as the vampire itself. Both men claimed authority over the Highgate case. Both rejected the other's version. Both became linked permanently to the story. For researchers of folklore, this rivalry is extremely important because it shows how legends are shaped not only by sightings, but by storytellers. A ghost story needs witnesses, a monster story needs believers, but a lasting legend needs conflict, and Highgate had plenty of it. Was the entity a vampire? Was it a ghost? Was it an occult force? Was it a hoax? Was it misinterpretation? Or was it a story that grew because people wanted it to be true? The rivalry kept the legend alive for decades. Even after the original panic faded, the debate continued, and every argument pulled the Highgate Vampire back into public attention. There are several possible explanations for the Highgate Vampire legend. The first is simple misidentification. Highgate Cemetery at dusk or night is full of strange shapes. Trees move, statues resemble figures, mist gathers between graves. A person walking in the distance could easily look unnatural. The second explanation is local rumor. Once people heard there was something strange in the cemetery, they began interpreting ordinary events through that lens. A shadow was no longer a shadow. It was the vampire. A dead animal was no longer a dead animal. It was evidence. A cold feeling was not just fear, it was a supernatural presence. The third explanation is media amplification. Newspapers and television did not create every part of the legend, but they helped transform it into a sensation. Once cameras arrived, the story became larger than the cemetery. The fourth explanation is deliberate theatricality. Some people involved in the case clearly understood the power of Gothic storytelling. The imagery was too strong to ignore. Cemeteries, vampires, occult rituals, hunters, stakes, ancient evil. It was horror mythology unfolding in real time. But there is one more possibility. The possibility that Highgate became a container for something deeper. A place where people projected fear, grief, fascination with death, and the thrill of forbidden places. In that sense, the vampire was real. Not necessarily as a physical creature, but as a legend powerful enough to change behavior, draw crowds, damage graves, and haunt British folklore for generations. The Highgate Vampire is one of the best examples of a modern urban legend. It did not come from medieval superstition. It did not emerge from some remote village centuries ago. It grew in modern London, with newspapers, television, public interviews, photographs, occult groups, and eyewitness claims. That makes it different from older vampire legends. This was not folklore passed down quietly around a fire. This was folklore accelerated by mass media, a supernatural story evolving almost in real time, and that may be why it still fascinates people. The Highgate Vampire sits between old and new. It has the Gothic atmosphere of the 1800s, the occult energy of the 1970s, and the viral structure of a modern internet legend. If the same story happened today, it would explode across social media. There would be shaky phone footage, reaction videos, paranormal live streams, debunking threads, drone shots over the cemetery, and within days, millions of people would know the name. But Highgate did it before the internet. That's what makes it so powerful. It spread the old-fashioned way, through fear, rumor, headlines, and the human need to believe something might be waiting in the dark. Today, Highgate Cemetery is preserved and respected as one of London's most historic burial grounds. It is famous for its architecture, its atmosphere, and the notable people buried there. But the vampire legend has never fully disappeared. Visitors still associate Highgate with the supernatural. Paranormal investigators still discuss it. Writers still analyze it. Horror fans still search for the truth behind the story. And the name remains unforgettable. The Highgate Vampire. It sounds ancient, but it is surprisingly modern. It sounds like folklore, but it was shaped by newspapers and television. It sounds impossible, but the panic around it was very real. That is the strange power of this case. You do not have to prove the vampire existed to understand why the legend survived. The cemetery itself does half the work. Walk through Highgate's old paths, past leaning stones and shadowed vaults, and the story begins to feel possible. Not certain, but possible. And sometimes, that is all a legend needs. So what was the Highgate Vampire? A ghost mistaken for a vampire? A media-fueled panic? A rivalry between occult personalities? A modern myth born from a decaying cemetery? Or something else entirely? The truth is, the Highgate Vampire may be less about an undead creature and more about how legends are born. First, someone sees something strange. Then, someone tells the story. Then the details grow. The shadows deepen. The figure becomes taller. The eyes begin to glow. The graveyard becomes cursed. And before long, the story escapes the place where it started. That is what happened at Highgate. A cemetery became a stage. A rumor became a headline. A shadow became a vampire. And decades later, people are still looking back at those overgrown paths, wondering what really moved between the tombs. Because the most frightening legends are not always the ones we can prove. They are the ones that refuse to stay buried. If you enjoyed this dive into the Highgate Vampire, leave a comment with your theory. Was it a real supernatural case, a hoax, or one of the greatest urban legends ever created? And if you want more dark folklore, haunted places, and true legends from the shadows of history, make sure to subscribe. Because some stories fade with time, but others wait in the dark, for someone to tell them again.